The morning of May 27, 1940, is warm for late spring, the kind of day that would feel almost ordinary, if not for the sound underneath it. Townshituend, artillery, constant, somewhere to the east, moving closer by the hour. In the small farming village of Le Paradis, in the Pas-de-Calais region of northern France, a company of the Royal Norfolk Regiment has spent the last 2 days doing the one thing that matters more than anything else in this collapsing corner of the war, holding a line long enough for tens of thousands of other men to reach the beaches at Dunkirk. They know what they're buying with every hour they hold. They know, most of them, that it probably isn't going to be enough time to save themselves. By late morning, the position is no longer a defense, it's a farmhouse under siege. The Royal Norfolks are dug in around a cluster of buildings, ammunition running low, casualties mounting, cut off from any hope of reinforcement or retreat. The men holding this ground belong to the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, under Major Liesl Ryder. They have been ordered to hold as long as physically possible. They have held for 2 full days against an enemy with overwhelming numerical and material advantage. By early afternoon, with ammunition exhausted and the farmhouse itself burning around them, there is nothing left to hold with. Ryder makes the only decision left available to a commander in his position: surrender. Under the laws of war that every professional army in Europe has operated under for decades, this is the end of the danger for these men, not the beginning of a new one. A soldier who lays down his weapon when his position is hopeless becomes a prisoner of war. He is disarmed, marched to the rear, registered, and held until the fighting ends. That is not a courtesy extended by the goodwill of the capturing force. It is a binding rule under the Geneva Convention, understood and accepted by every trained officer on every side of this war. Roughly 97 surviving members of the Royal Norfolks, many of them wounded, all of them out of ammunition. KTD2 walk out of the ruined farmhouse with their hands raised, expecting exactly that. The unit that accepts their surrender is the 3rd Company, 2nd Battalion, SS Totenkopf Division, under the command of SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Knöchlein, 29 years old, an SS officer who has led men in this division since its formation. Knöchlein is not a green recruit thrown into a chaotic battlefield without guidance. He is a trained SS company commander, operating with a clear chain of authority above him, and a clear understanding of what happens to a surrendering force under the rules his own army has signed on to. His men disarm the British soldiers exactly as procedure dictates, and then Knöchlein gives an order that has nothing to do with procedure at all. He directs the disarmed prisoners to be marched into a small farmyard enclosed on 2 sides by outbuildings, a pit-like space, walled in, with nowhere to run. The Royal Norfolks, unarmed, hands still raised, are lined up against the wall. 2 machine guns are set up facing them. The men in the SS company understand, in that moment, exactly what is about to happen, and there is no confusion in the ranks about the fact that these are surrendered, disarmed British soldiers, not combatants in an ongoing engagement. Knöchlein gives the order to fire. If you've stayed with this story this far, you already know why this channel exists. To sit inside the moment where the paperwork of war and the conscience of the men following it collide, and to follow what happens after, all the way to the record that eventually gets written down. That's the part worth staying for. The machine guns cut down the 97 men standing against that wall in a matter of minutes. When the shooting stops, SS soldiers move through the bodies with bayonets, finishing off anyone still showing signs of life. It is, by any definition available under the laws of war in 1940, a massacre of prisoners, not a battlefield death, not a tragic accident of a chaotic retreat, but a deliberate execution ordered and carried out against men who had already surrendered their weapons and their fight. 97 men fall in that farmyard. 2 do not die. Privates Albert Pooley and William O'Callaghan, both wounded and left for dead beneath the pile of bodies in the yard, survive the night, buried under their comrades. waiting in silence for the SS company to move on. When it is finally safe to move, the two men crawl free of the farmyard and are eventually sheltered by a sympathetic French farming family, hidden from German search patrols for days before being taken into custody as ordinary prisoners of war. Their identities as survivors of the farmyard massacre kept quiet, because staying alive depends on the Germans never learning what they'd witnessed. Pooley and O'Callaghan spend the remainder of the war in POW camps, carrying with them the one piece of testimony that no official report, no captured document, and no German officer's account will ever provide on its own. An eyewitness account of exactly what happened in that farmyard, and exactly who gave the order. The story does not end with the war. It ends, 5 years later, in a British courtroom. Seminade and Suls, but getting there takes the machinery of an entire post-war legal system, moving methodically through a devastated Europe, still sorting the guilty from the merely defeated. By 0900 hours the following morning, word of the Le Paradis Massacre has already reached British lines through fragments and rumor. Outside and a farmhouse overrun, a company simply gone. No clear account of what happened to the men who held it. It will take years, not hours, for the full picture to surface. Pooley and O'Callaghan are liberated at the war's end in 1945 and immediately bring their testimony to British authorities. The first solid confirmation that the missing men of the 2nd Royal Norfolks had not simply died in the fighting, but had been murdered after surrendering. Their account triggers a formal war crimes investigation, placed under the authority of the British War Crimes Investigation Unit, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Scotland, a veteran military intelligence officer tasked with tracking down and building prosecutable cases against German officers responsible for atrocities against British and Commonwealth prisoners across the entire European. Theatre Scotland's unit works the case the way most of these investigations work in the years immediately after the war, cross-referencing survivor testimony against captured German unit records, tracking the movements of the 3rd SS Totenkopf Company through France in May 1940, and identifying every officer who could plausibly have given the order that day. The name that keeps surfacing, confirmed independently by both Pooley and O'Callaghan, is Fritz Knöchlein. But identifying a suspect and locating him are two different problems entirely, in a continent full of displaced soldiers, false identities, and men actively trying to disappear into the chaos of a defeated Germany. Knöchlein is eventually located and taken into custody in the British occupation zone, initially processed as an ordinary former SS officer among thousands being screened after the surrender. His connection to Le Paradis not yet confirmed on paper, resting entirely on the memory of two men who had survived a machine gun wall 5 years earlier. Scotland's investigators build the case methodically. Statements are taken, cross-checked, and formalized. Knöchlein, when confronted, denies giving any such order, insisting the deaths occurred during active combat, not execution. It is precisely the kind of denial that makes eyewitness testimony the entire foundation of the case, and precisely why the survival of Pooley and O'Callaghan matters as much as it does to the story's outcome. The trial convenes in October 1948. Before a British military court in Hamburg, Germany, nearly 8.5 years after the farmyard executions took place. Knöchlein stands accused of ordering the murder of 97 disarmed prisoners of war, a war crime under the laws both Britain and Germany had formally recognized for decades before either side violated them. The prosecution's case rests almost entirely on the direct, consistent testimony of the two survivors, supported by corroborating statements from several of Knöchlein's own former SS subordinates, some of whom confirm under questioning that the order to fire had come directly and unambiguously from their company commander. The moment most often described from the trial itself is simple, and it doesn't require dramatization to carry weight. William O'Callaghan, called to testify, is asked to identify the man who gave the order to open fire on his unarmed comrades. He looks across the courtroom and points directly at Fritz Knöchlein. Knöchlein's defense: that the deaths occurred amid combat confusion, not deliberate execution, cannot withstand the specificity of what two men who lived through it, and several German soldiers who carried out the order, are all independently willing to say under oath in the same courtroom. The court finds Knöchlein guilty. He is sentenced to death. On January 21, 1949, Fritz Knöchlein is executed by hanging at Hamelin Prison, Arbeit an Fuhr, one of the last convicted war criminals from the Western theater of the war to face capital punishment under British military authority, nearly 9 years after the order he gave in a French farmyard. 95 of the 97 men killed at Le Paradis are today commemorated at the Le Paradis War Cemetery. A short walk from the farmyard where they died, their names recorded in permanent stone beside the barn wall itself, which still stands, marked today with a memorial plaque placed by survivors and the families of the dead. Albert Pooley, whose testimony helped identify Knöchlein, struggled for years afterward with the physical and psychological weight of what he had survived, and never fully recovered from the wounds, visible and otherwise, that he carried out of that farmyard. William O'Callaghan returned to an ordinary post-war life, carrying quietly for the rest of his years the singular fact of having pointed, in a courtroom nearly a decade later, at the man responsible for the deaths of 95 of his comrades. That's the detail worth sitting with when this story is finished. Not the machine guns, not the wall, not even the courtroom itself, but the two men who survived being buried under their friends, specifically so that, years later, someone could stand up in a room in Hamburg and say, under oath, exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. The record exists today because they lived long enough to give it. If stories like this one, the quiet ones, carried for years by the people who survived them until someone finally had a chance to write them down properly, are worth your time, that's exactly what this channel exists to keep doing. There's more of them.